The shrill, breathless voice sliced through the sterile calm of the 911 dispatch center. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice, practiced and even cut through the static. Yes, I need to report. There's a suspicious person in my neighborhood. The caller stammered, her voice tight with barely suppressed panic. On Elmwood Drive, right now. Ma'am, can you describe the suspicious person? The dispatcher prompted, the clicking of keys a subtle counterpoint to the caller's rising agitation. It's a teenager, she rushed out, the word almost spat. Black. He's just loitering, looking out of place. You know the type. Doesn't live around here. I can tell you that much. A pause, then a sharper intake of breath. Peeking into windows, I think. Could be casing houses. Definitely up to no good. Unseen, unheard Michael, a lean 16-year-old with a backpack slung over one shoulder, stood on the sidewalk of Elmwood Drive, bathed in the warm hues of a late afternoon sun. He was scrolling through his phone, ostensibly absorbed, but a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He felt the eyes on him, a prickling sensation at the back of his neck. He glanced subtly towards the large, manicured lawn across the street, spotting a flicker of movement behind the lace-curtained window of a pristine colonial house. Mrs. Davison. He'd seen her before, always tending her roses with a hawk-like intensity, her gaze sharp and assessing. He shifted his weight, trying to appear nonchalant, though his heart had begun to tap a quicker rhythm against his ribs. He was just waiting for his mom. Study group at David's had run a little long, and she was supposed to pick him up any minute. He checked his phone again. Still no text. He resisted the urge to call, not wanting to seem impatient. But the feeling of being watched intensified, becoming almost palpable. It was more than just observation. It was scrutiny, laced with something colder, something accusatory. He could practically feel the weight of Mrs. Davison's judgment pressing down on him. He straightened up, trying to project an air of confidence he didn't quite feel, and looked directly at the house. The curtain twitched again, and this time he saw her face, pale and pinched, framed by the window. Her eyes, magnified by the glass, were fixed on him, unwavering, unwelcoming. Then, the front door of the house across the street creaked open. Mrs. Davison emerged, still clutching her phone to her ear, her free hand gesturing emphatically as she spoke into it. She marched towards the edge of her lawn, her gaze never leaving Michael. He froze, a sudden, unwelcome spotlight illuminating him on the quiet suburban street. Yes, officer, he's still here. Mrs. Davison's voice, now louder, carried across the manicured lawns. Just standing there, staring. It's unsettling. She rounded on Michael, her voice sharpening, the polite veneer of her 911 call dissolving into open hostility. You! Yes, you! She snapped, pointing a finger, her voice rising in pitch. What are you doing here? Why are you loitering in this neighborhood? Michael swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He opened his mouth to explain, but Mrs. Davison steamrolled over him. Don't you live around here, do you? Where do you even live? Huh? Answer me. Her voice was laced with a demand for answers, an assumption of guilt that hung heavy in the humid air. Just then, a distant wail pierced the suburban quiet, growing rapidly louder. Police sirens. Michael's stomach plummeted. This was escalating and fast. He saw Mrs. Davison's lips curl into a thin, self-satisfied smirk. She had called them, over him, for waiting for his mom. As the sirens screamed closer, a sleek, dark sedan turned onto Elmwood Drive, pulling smoothly to a stop at the curb right beside Michael. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out. Tall, composed, impeccably dressed in a formal dark suit. She moved with an air of quiet authority. It was his mom. Relief washed over Michael, so potent it almost buckled his knees. But Mrs. Davison's smirk didn't falter. It widened, if anything, as two police cruisers, lights flashing, tires crunching on gravel, screeched to a halt behind his mother's car. She expected backup, validation. She expected to be proven right. Then, Agent Sarah Walker turned towards the approaching officers, her expression calm, her voice clear and carrying, cutting through the rising tension and the whine of the fading sirens. She reached into her jacket, producing a badge that glinted silver in the afternoon sun. "Officers," she stated, her gaze unwavering, her voice resonating with undeniable authority. "Agent Walker, FBI. This is my son." Mrs. Davison's smirk vanished. Her mouth remained slightly open, her eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on Agent Walker, fixed on the badge. Speechless, the two police officers, halfway out of their cruisers, froze, their expressions shifting from professional alertness to utter, bewildered confusion. Michael stood there, caught between relief and a dawning, uneasy understanding of just how wrong things had almost gone. The silence that descended on Elmwood Drive was thick, almost suffocating. Mrs. Davison's face, moments ago flushed with self-righteous indignation, was now a mask of stunned disbelief. Her eyes darted between Agent Walker's composed figure, the glinting FBI badge, and the two uniformed police officers who seemed to have momentarily forgotten how to move. One of the officers, a young man with a neatly trimmed mustache, finally found his voice, though it wavered slightly. "Agent Walker?" he stammered, glancing at his partner for confirmation that he wasn't hallucinating. His partner, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, simply nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the badge. Agent Walker remained unruffled, her posture radiating calm authority. "That's correct, officer," she stated, her tone even and professional. "Agent Sarah Walker, Federal Bureau of Investigation. And this," she gestured towards Michael, placing a hand briefly on his shoulder, "is my son, Michael Walker. He was waiting for me after a study session with a friend down the street." The young officer blinked, then turned to Mrs. Davison, a flicker of dawning comprehension, and perhaps a hint of embarrassment, crossing his face. "Ma'am," he began, his voice now carefully neutral. "You called in a report about?" He trailed off, the unspoken question hanging in the air. "About what, exactly?" Mrs. Davison remained speechless for another beat. Then a strangled sound escaped her lips, something between a cough and a gasp. But he looked," she finally sputtered, her carefully constructed narrative crumbling around her. She gestured vaguely at Michael, unable to articulate the suspicious actions she had so vehemently described just moments before. Agent Walker's gaze sharpened, focusing on Mrs. Davison with an intensity that seemed to physically shrink the older woman. "He looked like what, Mrs. Davison?" she asked, her voice dropping a degree, becoming dangerously soft. "Like a teenager waiting for his mother? Or was there something else about his appearance that triggered your concern?" The air crackled with unspoken tension. The police officers shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware they were standing in the middle of a deeply personal and potentially explosive confrontation. Michael, still reeling from the rapid shift in dynamics, watched his mother with a mixture of admiration and a knot of anxiety in his chest. Mrs. Davison stammered, her face flushing a mottled red. "Well, he was just standing there, and in this neighborhood we have to be vigilant. For safety." Her voice was weak, unconvincing even to her own ears. Agent Walker's eyebrow arched almost imperceptibly. Vigilant, Mrs. Davison? Or prejudiced? The word hung in the air, heavy and accusatory. My son was doing nothing wrong. He was simply existing while black in your vicinity. Could it be? Agent Walker pressed, her voice now laced with steel, that his skin color played a role in your perception of him as suspicious? Mrs. Davison recoiled as if physically struck. No, absolutely not. I'm not prejudiced, she protested, her voice rising in pitch again, teetering on the edge of hysteria. I was being cautious. Responsible. Agent Walker repeated, a hint of scorn in her tone. Responsible would have been asking him if he needed help, or simply minding your own business. Instead, you chose to call the police based on what? A feeling? A stereotype? The silence returned, heavier than before. Mrs. Davison's eyes darted around, seeking an escape, an ally, finding none. The police officers stood like statues, observing, unwilling to intervene in what was clearly a deeply personal and racially charged moment. Michael watched Mrs. Davison's carefully constructed facade of suburban respectability begin to crumble, revealing something uglier underneath. Suddenly, a new voice broke the tension. A man's voice, sharp and authoritative, cutting through the awkward tableau. Eleanor? What in God's name is going on out here? A man in a crisp business suit strode out of the Davison house, his brow furrowed with concern, then shifting to irritation as he took in the scene. The police cruisers, Agent Walker, Michael, and his wife's stricken face. Mr. Davison. He was a local politician. Michael vaguely remembered seeing his face on campaign signs. Eleanor? He repeated, his gaze now fixed on Agent Walker, assessing, calculating. Mrs. Davison turned to her husband, her eyes pleading. Richard, this woman, she's FBI, and she's accusing me. Her voice trailed off, unable to articulate the full extent of her public humiliation. Mr. Davison's eyes narrowed, focusing on Agent Walker, then on Michael. A different kind of tension entered the air now, a political calculation replacing the raw, prejudiced fear. He stepped forward, extending a hand towards Agent Walker, a practiced, politician's smile plastered on his face. Agent Walker, is it? Richard Davison. My wife was just understandably concerned about neighborhood safety. We've had a few incidents lately. He waved a dismissive hand, attempting to downplay the situation, to regain control. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding? Agent Walker did not take his hand. Her gaze remained fixed and unwavering. No misunderstanding, Mr. Davison, she stated, her voice cold and final. Your wife called the police on my son because he is black, and she deemed him suspicious for simply standing on a public sidewalk. That is not vigilance. That is prejudice. And it is unacceptable. Richard Davison's politician's smile faltered, cracking slightly under the unwavering gaze of Agent Walker. He dropped his outstretched hand, a flicker of annoyance replacing the forced geniality. Now, see here, Agent Walker, he began, his voice hardening with a new edge of authority. I understand you're upset, but my wife was acting out of an abundance of caution. We all need to be responsible for our community's safety. Agent Walker remained unmoved. Safety is not a justification for racial profiling, Mr. Davison, and abundance of caution should not translate to immediate suspicion based on skin color. She paused, her gaze sweeping between Mr. and Mrs. Davison, then encompassing the small group of onlookers who had begun to gather at the edges of their lawns, drawn by the flashing police lights and raised voices. This isn't just about my son. or your wife's misguided actions. This is about a larger issue, a societal issue that plays out in communities across this country every single day. Unexpectedly, Agent Walker's tone shifted again, softening, becoming less accusatory and more constructive. "Instead of pursuing charges for a false police report, Mrs. Davison," she said, turning her attention back to the still speechless woman, "I propose something different, something perhaps more impactful." Richard Davison's eyebrows shot up, intrigued despite himself. Mrs. Davison blinked, slowly emerging from her state of shock, a flicker of wary curiosity in her eyes. Even the police officer straightened, sensing a shift in the dynamic. "I propose a community dialogue," Agent Walker continued, her voice clear and steady, "facilitated by the FBI. A frank conversation about racial bias, about assumptions, about what it truly means to be vigilant versus simply prejudiced. A conversation where we can all learn, and hopefully, move forward." A murmur rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. Mr. Davison's politician's instincts kicked in. He saw an opportunity to manage the situation, to spin it, perhaps even to gain some public goodwill. "A dialogue?" he echoed, consideringly. "Well, Eleanor and I are always supportive of community initiatives." He glanced at his wife, a silent pressure in his gaze. Mrs. Davison hesitated, her internal conflict visibly playing out on her face. Publicly acknowledging her misjudgment, her prejudice, was a bitter pill to swallow. But the alternative, the simmering disapproval of her neighbors, the potential for formal complaints, the undeniable authority of the FBI agent standing before her, was perhaps worse. Slowly, reluctantly, she nodded. A tiny, almost imperceptible nod, but a nod nonetheless. "Very well," Agent Walker said, her voice firm, accepting. "I will arrange it. I expect full participation, Mrs. Davison, and public acknowledgement of your misjudgment." There was no room for negotiation in her tone. The following weeks saw Elmwood Drive abuzz, not with neighborhood gossip, but with preparations for the unprecedented community dialogue. Agent Walker, true to her word, organized everything, bringing in FBI specialists in community relations and bias training. The local community center was booked. Flyers were distributed. News even trickled into the local paper. The day of the dialogue arrived, fraught with nervous anticipation. The community center was packed. Agent Walker stood at the front, composed and professional, introducing the session, outlining the ground rules, respect, honesty, and a willingness to listen. Then, she turned to Mrs. Davison, seated in the front row, visibly uncomfortable under the collective gaze of her neighbors. Mrs. Davison, pale and trembling slightly, walked to the podium. She spoke haltingly at first, her voice barely above a whisper. She admitted her fear, her assumptions, her mistake in calling the police without any real evidence. She didn't offer excuses, didn't try to justify her actions. She simply acknowledged her bias, the ingrained prejudices she had never truly confronted until that afternoon on Elmwood Drive. It wasn't a moment of dramatic catharsis, no sudden outpouring of tears or confessions of deep-seated racism. It was awkward, uncomfortable, and undeniably real. The silence in the room was heavy, not with accusation, but with a dawning sense of shared responsibility. The dialogue that followed was equally challenging, with moments of tension, defensiveness, but also, surprisingly, moments of genuine connection and understanding. People spoke, listened, and for the first time, perhaps, truly heard each other. Later that evening, as Agent Walker and Michael drove away from Elmwood Drive, the streetlights casting long shadows on the quiet suburban streets, Michael finally broke the comfortable silence. "Mom," he said, his voice thoughtful, That was intense. Agent Walker nodded, her gaze fixed on the road ahead. It was. Do you think she really understood? Michael asked, the question laced with a teenager's inherent skepticism. Agent Walker sighed, a weary but hopeful sound. I don't know, Michael. Prejudice isn't erased overnight. But understanding, acknowledgement, that's a start. Sometimes the badge of truth isn't about making arrests or solving cases. Sometimes it's about holding a mirror up to ourselves, to our communities, and forcing us to see what's really there, even when it's ugly. She glanced at Michael, a small, proud smile gracing her lips. And sometimes, she added, her voice softer, it's about showing your son that even in the face of prejudice, strength, and truth can prevail. Michael leaned back in his seat, the weight in his chest easing slightly. The badge of truth. He understood a little better now the weight his mother carried, the responsibility it represented, and the quiet, powerful way she chose to wield it, not just as a symbol of authority, but as an instrument of change, one difficult conversation at a time.